Are you guys at U of T or?
Kara studies with me.
Oh, great. Okay. Undergrad, grad.
Undergrad.
Okay. Awesome.
We're here.
Oh, nice.
An end in sight.
Yeah, the home stretch. And then, yeah. Okay, we'll get it going. All right, so welcome to Rivers number 6. It's a collaboration between the CLC, the Canadian League of Composers, and the CMC, the Canadian Music Center. A series of workshops that Joseph Glazier and I put together starting last year. We're really thrilled to be joined today by Abigail Richardson Schulte for a discussion that I've called A View from the Jury Room. So this is one of the first things Joseph and I thought up when we started, because there's a lot of workshops that cover how to write a grant from the perspective of the person writing the grant. And there's not a lot, if any, workshops of Sorry, guys. You'd think by 2023, on version 6 of this workshop, that we'd have it sorted, but we don't. So am I keeping my microphone on now? Okay, well, let's hope it works. So just before we get going, a little bit about Abigail. She was born in England, raised here in Canada, won first the prestigious UNESCO International Rostrum of Composers, which resulted in broadcasts in 35 countries. She won the Karen Kieser Prize. She's won a Dora Mae Moore Award for Best New Opera. She was the affiliate composer of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra for many years, and wrote the very popular music for the classic Canadian story, The Hockey Sweater by Roch Carrier, which was a triple commission with the TSO, the National Arts Centre, and the Calgary Philharmonic Orchestra. You were saying it's been performed now?
I think 180 times in Canada and a dozen in France.
So that's about as good as it gets. Yeah. for Canadian composers. And Abigail is perhaps, well, the TSO thing is super relevant, and Abigail served on many juries, but particularly relevant today is Abigail is currently the composer in residence at the Hamilton Philharmonic Orchestra, which runs a composer in residence program that we're going to talk a little bit about, and serves as the artistic director of the HBO's What Next Festival. For the folks here, if you've got a question at any time, just pop your hand up. We'll try to get it in. If not, save it till the end. Folks who are online, I've got the chat open. I see Joseph's mentioned it, but just to reiterate, I've got the chat open. So if you have a question, just pop it in. And again, if it works to get it in when you ask it, I'll ask it. And if we have to wait till the end, I'll make sure it gets asked at the end. So I wanted to start with a kind of very basic question, because I think a lot of composers haven't served on juries or haven't chaired a jury and haven't been part of the process. And so what does the process look like? A jury room or a jury Zoom? What goes on in there?
Well, first of all, I mean, there are different levels. There's Canada Council, we have provincial, and then we have municipal. So they're all a little bit different. There are typically 3 or 5 jury members. And again, depending on the level, you'll get people with different qualifications. So if we look at Canada Council, you know, they're going to be new music specialists, and you'll definitely have a composer. You'll have a performer who's a new music specialist, and you know, a third who, you know, well, somebody again from new music, but not necessarily a composer. Then when we go to municipal, that is where it starts to get quite interesting, because the municipal are like they're not specialist composition juries, right, from the new music scene. So you might have 5 people sitting around. I've been on one where it's, you know, I am the classical person. Then we have someone who's country and western, someone who's world music, someone who's hip hop, someone who's a singer songwriter, right? So all of those combined makes, oh, for an interesting week. So they're often typically a week. You might have a renewal for another week. A lot of, my goodness, juries are getting so busy, so there are just so many applications. So you really do have to consider that when you're writing grants to different levels. If it's municipal, bear in mind that you're not really going to have the specialists on there. So make your application accordingly. Yeah, I mean, you get it, again, it's a little bit different depending on the level of it, but you might get you know, a tablet with all of them on it. But anyway, I mean, you're certainly, you've previewed the applications, and then when you go through it at the time, it's kind of a reminder, and so you read it all through, and then as a group, you listen to the support material, right? So you listen to one piece, and then we can get into this a little bit later too, you know, in some more detail, and then you all kind of look at each other, go on to the next piece, look at each other, there's a bit of silence, and then you vote. And it's not like you're voting like yes or no, this gets funding. There's a little bit of discussion around the room. You generally go around one by one and say what you thought of the application, and then you give it a number. And the challenge to it is that you grade very differently at the beginning of the week compared to the end of the week.
Yeah.
I don't know if you get pickier or less picky. I don't know. I haven't quite figured that out yet, but it's very different. And then you also take into account what other people say. Also, when we're going with you know, different genres and people from different parts of the country, you have biases on the jury. We can't help but have biases, so sometimes it can get a little bit heated, right? So if you have somebody from a certain region of Canada who's quite protective over their scene, they are going to try to push through more. Also, if, for example, they have a provincial arts council that doesn't fund commissions, they're going to want to push through more because their people can't get it any other way, right? So you get a little bit of push. It can get tense, and that it actually gets tense more on competition juries, that sort of thing. Also, think about scenes. If people, you know, we probably like the music we're writing more, we might tend to give that a higher mark, and therefore something else a lower mark that we're not writing. But so it's our job as jury members to try to take out that bias. And so I think granting officers try their best to you know, find people who are actually good at juries so that they won't be bringing that, but inevitably it's kind of there. So on some juries, you know, on a Friday after lunch, they say, okay, go and have a nice lunch, and then they bring back all of the results and say, okay, here is where the line is drawn. This is above here is everything that gets funded, and below the line is where everything, you know, doesn't get funded. And that's when everyone's jaws drop, right? Because we don't grade these thinking, again, like I said, yes or no. And I think we all expect that a whole lot more is going to get funded. Some juries just don't even do that. They figure out the finances and just according to the grades. But some juries will let the jury members kind of, after the perspective of the week, push things up a little bit, push things down just around the line. That's about it. Yeah. So there we are.
It's I will say, having chaired a few juries and never having served on one before, it was quite eye-opening to see what does happen in the room. So I appreciate the kind of depth you went into in that answer. We do have one question here, which is I actually could probably speak to as well, but I'll throw it to you. When going through applications, do you get them sorted alphabetically or by submission order? Like, is there sometimes a certain order in which you are presented them, or is that, I guess that's sort of more of the chair's decision?
Yeah. I have absolutely seen them both ways, alphabetical or through something random. I'm not sure. Yeah, and I think that probably plays an element too. If you're A, everybody's very fresh, but you also don't know. I mean, at what point in the day's going to break, and then you come back the next day and start. So it's not necessarily a disadvantage.
Right. So let's get to something a bit more subjective, I guess, but in the most broad terms, and I guess we can address this in different contexts. So we can address this in the grant context versus the program context versus, say, the call for scores context. But what makes an application good and what makes an application bad? Which I realize is a painfully broad question, but if we start there, we can dig in a bit more.
Yeah, sure. Maybe we should go by topic first of all.
Okay.
So project description, right?
Yeah.
What makes a bad project description is a kind of I don't care. I scribbled down a few sentences, and there's just not very much content there. That's kind of a given. Also, what makes a bad one is when composers are specifically writing an application almost like it's a theory assignment, and they're very specific. Maybe they're passionate about what they want to do, but as jurors, we don't want to see the ins and outs, the really specific things about how they're going to form their chords, right? It's right. Just so instead we're talking about concepts, and also why you want to write this piece, why it's important to you. Something that's a bit of a personal story can be helpful. I mean, you also don't want to go too far down that road, right? Mm-hmm. But something so that we get a sense of you, because in masses of applications, you want to show us who you are. It's kind of like, when you're a composer on stage and you're introducing your piece, you want to show the audience a little bit about who you are. Same sort of thing in a grant application. You also want to say, why, like I said, why you want to write this piece, but why you want to write this piece for this performer or this ensemble. That fit is really key. And I don't think people understand enough how the fit is so important. Same thing with the letter from the commissioner. It's just terrible if the commissioner writes, I want to commission this composer. Done, right? It has to be like, why? How did you meet each other? Have you worked before? And what sort of common vision do you have for this? How are you going to get it out into the world? That kind of thing. The project descriptions, they have a suggested word count in general, right? And you don't have to fill it up, because we know when it's just fill, and mm-hmm. there are a lot of things to read. If you don't need to write it, it's great if you don't. But please tell us what you want to do and why, and just try to make it compelling. That's probably the most important thing, besides the musical examples. Also, just one word of advice about bios. Often many of us do different things. Some people are half performer, half composer. It doesn't serve you well if you submit your performer bio. Instead, write a line about being a performer in your composer bio. So I've definitely seen that. And at programs too, people will apply, and they're really, their bio is all about being a conductor or a violinist or whatever. So, you want to show that you're a specialist.
Right.
Also, in terms of programs, if we're talking about programs as well at this point, what makes a good application is to read the program description. That seems really obvious, but it's not. So for one thing, at the Hamilton Philharmonic Orchestra, we have a composer fellowship program that's been running for 5 years. And for one thing, you know, people have to be living in Canada with a visitor's visa at the minimum. It's surprising how many people from different countries apply, and they just obviously look at calls all around the world and just, you know, send out their material. So they're just not eligible. They don't even get in the door. Now, in a jury and a grant situation, jurors wouldn't even see that. They're already sort of filtered out, right, by the grant officer. But in a program, you get it. Also, you know, people not reading how much of a commitment it is. Like we say, this is not just a commission. Like, we want you to be involved with us for a year, for a concert season, and get to know the orchestra in so many ways. And yet in their applications, they'll write, I'll be available for the premiere and nothing else. They also, you know, we say, you know, what do you want to get out of this program, and list all of these things we do. And so many of them just talk about the commission. And I'm like, did you read the application? Do you know this is a much longer program? It's not just a commission. So that's kind of frustrating, actually. And that puts me in a bad mood when they're reading their application.
Right.
Like, I want to see that they recognize what we're doing and that they can actually engage with it. So what has their experience been in these different things that we want them to do? Like things that a composer in residence has to do, like a lot of public speaking and community work and education and arts admin, and, you know, what do they want to get out of it? So that's very important.
Yeah, I'm just going to sit on that because I think that's the one that, so CLC runs the Pivot Mentorship Program, and the actual mentorship question is a really important part of the application. And I wonder if maybe speaking a little bit more about how, because I think that's also where sometimes some red flags come up, is that what do I want to get from a program, or what do I want to get from this thing? And I was wondering if you had any more kind of thoughts on, like, you might read something and be like, oh, that's just so careerist. I don't want to have that person, or that person hasn't thought maybe about their career enough, and it's all about head in the sand aesthetics. Like, I wonder if you could speak to that particular question maybe just a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, some people apply kind of with an ulterior motive, I think. Like, they're a violinist or a conductor, and they actually apply with wanting to put themselves on stage. So that's a bit of a red flag. Some people apply wanting to arrange a piece of theirs that already exists and get that on the main stage. And that's a bit of a cop-out because they're being paid to write a new piece, right? So that might be one. Career stage is a really, really important thing. I mean, we're clear that they should be kind of like sort of emerging professional composer. And so when people apply and they have already had loads of, successful grant applications and commissions from orchestra and that sort of thing, they might have been executive director in an organization and they're applying, or they may be, a conductor of an orchestra applying. That I just say, okay, you want the commission, you don't want the program. We don't need to teach you about the orchestra world. So absolutely, finding that right fit is very important.
Yeah. So digging a little bit into the good, and I think you touched on this a bit, and especially when you're talking about the project description. But, and I've seen this, like, you kind of get to a point where you have 10 or 20 good applications, or that are all relatively strong, and then you're trying to look at, the way I'd phrase, like, what makes an application pop? What are the things that can sort of, in your experience, because we've seen so many applications over the years for different sorts of things, and again, we can talk about it in the different contexts, but have you noticed that there are certain things that successful applicants do that really make it go from, like, that's an 85, like it's in a pack of 85s, and now it's a 95, like, right, that special little bit of something, the special sauce.
Yeah. And it's interesting you note the numbers, because that's exactly right. Like, if you've got applications sort of in the 80s, they're probably not going to be funded. You're looking at that you have to be really, really high. So I want to stress to everybody that just because you didn't get the grant didn't mean that it wasn't a good application. It could be a really, really pretty good application. There can also be some, preferences on the jury. There are some things maybe you could do better. You could, reapply next time. So I think that's one thing we have a tendency to say, oh, it's probably terrible, it didn't work, but it could have been 87 and didn't get funded, right? So that's when it's good to talk to a grant officer, and then you might feel a bit better and I can reapply. But yeah, what makes things great? Like I said, the fit between commissioner and composer, that's actually really huge. if you get an application, like say you have a music director or conductor writing a letter saying, I really want to commission this composer. I have known about their music for a while. I have have conducted this piece, and we feel like it would be excellent for our organization to, take this to another level and, support them in this way. Well, that's much better. Or same thing with performer. Also, what makes this unique? Like if you're applying to write a string quartet, you better have some string quartets. Well, not better, but you may have some string quartet material. So why is this so extra special that you need to be funded this time? Well, maybe you can help make it extra special by getting, for example, a number of partners involved. That's always quite impressive. And you see that again and again. You mentioned in my bio that the Hockey Sweater was commissioned by 3 orchestras, and that was really the first triple commission in Canada. And that was TSO that then went to 2 other orchestras, and they jumped on board. That's great. So for me, it was good. It didn't actually change the amount of money I got, but it changed the number of premieres I got. And it, it really helped to kind of make it a splash, and then other orchestras did it. So that kind of idea, and some applications I've seen have been really successful when it might be a collaboration between a Montreal organization and a Vancouver organization. Specifically, say it's for opera, like something really expensive, and that you really, it's a lot of buy-in. Community, we talk about community, and I think people don't have a great sense of what that is. Like, in some larger cities, there may be, well, there's always a need for community, but some larger organizations don't necessarily do a lot of community, whereas in sort of regional ensembles, they're partnering with their community. They've got co-productions, they've got groups coming in,
outreach programs,
exactly, education. They've got students coming into the concert, all of that. So those sorts of things can be really important. But it's also just great music. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
We're gonna get to that, because I think that's its own. In some ways, that's like I don't know what's the $64 million question, but I think that we're gonna get to that one in a minute, because I think that's going to be a big discussion. Okay. Also sort of talked on this, but and I think some of them are obvious. Like you said, like if you're ineligible for something that you're applying for, if you've just not filled out an entire section or included an example. But red flags, because obviously if you've got this huge pile of applications, I don't mean to sound cynical, but basically any excuse you have to shrink that down, you're probably going to take advantage of, especially like later in the week. And I'm wondering, beyond the obvious, what are sort of things that just sort of make you go, no, sorry, bye?
It's so if we can talk here for just a moment about some priority groups. If we look at even just young people, like under a certain age, maybe they don't have professional experience. That's a big one. Maybe they're trying to write for students or a student situation. Again, if this were a granting organization, they wouldn't let them get in the door. Right. So that sort of level, just making sure that's the right level. Sometimes, now there are so many more people applying for the grant with priority group focus and equity, that can be challenging, specifically with programs. For example, with if people are writing, like they're not necessarily quote unquote classically trained, right? And they might apply to write a piece using their culture, and that's great, except that they have to fit into the orchestra. And so they just can't, they don't have the skills, and they might write in their application that they're looking forward to us teaching them the skills about how to write for orchestra. So it's just the wrong level. It's, again, the wrong sort of fit.
It's almost a grant for program thing again.
Yeah, or like you should be going to a workshop,
yeah,
kind of thing, instead of like a professional program. So definitely that's one. People that don't have the skills, you might think that everybody applying for a grant is at a professional level, but they're not. So some of them could get very, very low scores just based on that. Even, if an application is written in a very arrogant way, there's a bit of a reaction from the jury to say, oh yeah, okay,
right,
here's your mark, right? Or at the same time, if one is overly kind of sucky, it goes the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, red flags. Again, the fit. I'll give you another example about program. We've had some really excellent composers apply to our program who are retired, who spent a lifetime as a teacher, maybe a music teacher. And they've got really great music they wrote in 1976. But that's not relevant for us now, and
Right.
we don't need to prepare them for a life as a, you know, in the music scene as a career. So that's a really tough one to turn down. And I'd actually love to see a program for, you know, retired, like, you know, music people who wanted to be a composer but just didn't and went a different direction. And there are so many of them now. Like,
Yeah.
I see so many of them, you know, applying to the Canadian Music Center. You know,
Yeah.
so that's an issue. Another one about old pieces. Old pieces are a red flag, right? Even if they are 10 years ago, that a lot of jurors would consider, oh, that's old, so you're not getting much done. You know, you got to send us something which is more current. And that can be quite frustrating, I think, especially for people who've been on the scene for a while, because they know the exact right fit, you know, for musical examples. And that isn't it. So yeah, just I guess red flags. Also, you know, potentially saying that there will be community involvement or education and not detailing at all, like just sort of throwing those things in there with no backup. Like, oh, right,
Yeah.
thanks for throwing us that buzzword. You don't have anything to back it up.
Yeah.
So that can actually harm you. So if you're going to put it in there, make sure you back it up and explain it.
Right. Would you say that, just sort of a random aside, but is it, I mean, I get the more experience you get, obviously it becomes the case, but how obvious is it when A, someone's put the application together at the last minute, or B, like you say, is, pardon my language, a little bit full. Like, how that's, is that obvious, or is that so, you know?
Yeah, you can see that. I mean, when really somebody is sort of full of it, you just look at their resume and you see, you know, or their CV, you know, how much they've written and for who.
Right.
And then also, you know, sometimes jurors will go to people's websites and, you know, try to get it. Like, if something is at all unclear, and this sometimes, you know, become a discussion point, like, oh, I'm not sure what they're meaning. I'm not sure if they actually have done this, that kind of thing. Then invariably one of the jurors has gone to their website and figured it out. And
right.
Said, actually, it was this, and they, you know, do a little bit of research. So you can't fake it. It's very risky to do that.
Also, keep your websites updated and relevant.
It's true.
Just in case.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we move on, one sort of more specific question here. When you say current, like what is current? Like, what is the sort of, is there even a threshold where it's like, obviously 10 years is a long time, but is there kind of a threshold for what is too old of a thing to submit as a piece of support material? Or is it?
Yeah, I don't know that I can exactly say that. And it depends, of course, on the jurors too. Some people won't notice it. But yeah, I mean, if you've got something from that's older than 10 years, like if you've got something that's 30 years old, people tend to raise eyebrows and say, oh, they've been out of the scene. Okay, no, we got to investigate this. What have they been doing? You know, so I guess you just want to show that you're current and out there and doing things.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good lead into the support material question, which I think we can spend a fair amount of time on. So, so I know there's very different context, again, for grants versus programs versus, someone's mentioned in the chat, like just straight up calls for scores.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's pick 2 examples, sometimes it's pick 2 minutes, or, you know, or 3 examples that are 5 minutes in total, or there's so many different permutations of what gets asked for. And I think it can be, especially when you're doing it for the first time, a little bit intimidating. It's either intimidating or something you just kind of don't think of. You're like, oh, I'm just going to put my 2 most recent pieces in there. So I'm just going to kind of turn it over to you about support material. And why don't we start with audio versus necessarily scores? Let's start with like audio support materials.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so the main thing is like, even though it's just a, like, you know, upload the link or whatever, your portion, it's not that simple. A lot of people, I think, leave that to the end. It's often at the end of the application, and you spend a lot of time, you know, working out the words for everything else and your budget and everything, and then you just want to upload your 2 audio files, right? But I'll share a story with you. I was on a jury at a municipal arts council. I won't say which one, but 5 people around the table from all different types of music. And across the week, I'm trying to teach them what makes good classical contemporary music, right? And anyway, on one of the later days, I came across an application of a composer I knew, and I knew his work very, very well. And he wrote a nice, very nice application. And then it came time to the musical examples. And same thing, just uploaded the 2 pieces. At that point, it was in their entirety. But I mean, juries listen to usually most of the first excerpt, and at a certain point, like less of the second excerpt. Those, like, you're reading the application, listening in the background, generally not following the score, maybe flipping to the score here and there. And sometimes the scores they're generally not paper anymore, but anyway, they're in a different document, right? So you're here and there, you're definitely not following the score the whole time, right? Because you're gonna have to talk about this in just a few minutes. So at a certain point in the second piece, eyes look up few, and you sort of nod to the grant officer, who then turns off the musical example, right? So your first example is going to be listened to more than the second. That's number one. Anyway, in this case, he just uploaded 2 different pieces. And the thing is, they were both very slow to start and very similar. So in a way, I was kind of proud when we got to the guy who was the DJ, and he said, this music is just too similar. It's kind of the same piece written twice. It didn't really go anywhere, and I just don't have patience for this. But very different, because at the beginning of the week he wouldn't have been able to assess it. But that was very sad for me, because I knew this composer was great and had excellent material. So there's a lesson in it: choose your excerpts really carefully. The other thing is, if your excerpts sound too similar, invariably you're going to have a jury member say, sounds like the same piece twice. One trick pony. Like, it won't be as overtly negative as that, but like, it's just like, that's the same piece. So build in contrast, right, between the 2. Also, you really want to make sure that you've got pieces that are like what you're submitting. Like, so if we go to our program at the HPO, we specifically ask for a large ensemble piece or orchestra piece. You can have 1 MIDI, but we really prefer if you've had real performances, even if it's a reading. And you'd be surprised how many times people submit a solo or a duet or an electro piece or even an improv piece or an arrangement, which is even worse, because that is not your material, even if it's written for orchestra, right? So those are just throwaways. So I even scan the applications for those types of things, and they don't even get then to a further jury. I'm like the gatekeeper in a way, like the grant officer to make those happen. So and then the other thing is, so as you could gather from that, if you're applying to an orchestra program, you want to submit large ensemble or orchestra music, right? Same thing when you're doing a grant application, and this can be harder for younger people who don't have great audio yet, right? Because of course you want to submit something which makes you sound good. But if you're writing a piece for strings, make sure you've got something that has strings in there, like 100%, no matter what it is. You don't want to submit something that's electro for writing a chamber piece. So that has to be a fit. And then, like I said, the contrast between the 2 is very important. And think about wowing them in the first, and then I don't know, making something beautiful in the second. Like, think about it as an experience for that jury member.
Almost like you want to have a hook.
Yeah. And you want to think about it too, like, keep them listening. Like, maybe choose a section which is like a build up, and give them the climactic section, and then then cut it off, whatever, and then go into a next one. I mean, you can figure out the best way to do it, but it's really, really important. I mean, also, if it doesn't necessarily need to be the exact same instrumentation. Like, say if you have again, back to this idea of a string quartet. I want to write a string quartet. I've already written 6, but I want to write another one. So you say, okay, here's an example of a string quartet. And then here's an example, could be like of a completely different piece, but it not a string quartet. It could be for anything else, but it follows up on what you have written in your project description, right? So this is my idea, or to say, yeah, I touched on this in another piece, and you could play that example, and I'm going to follow it up in this piece and do something here. So making them all kind of part of the whole, like it's the story of you and your journey. Yeah.
And I guess that also, like, again, if it all fits together, that's going to make it stand out a little bit more when you are coming to that moment where you have to pick out a 1 out of the 10, or
Yeah.
you're on Friday and you're trying to remember what you heard on Monday. And
yeah,
if everything sort of fits together and strings that narrative together,
exactly,
it's going to just stick in your head more than the kind of generic,
yeah,
oh, that's interesting.
yeah.
And
if you have the opportunity to write in your description why you chose it, some grant applications will let you do that.
Okay.
Or you can even build that into your project description. Like I said, like you can find ways to put it in there, but tell them why what you're submitting is important and why that is important in the narrative.
As I touched on in my piece, so
Yes.
I'd like to
And then
explore
in
this
brackets,
idea.
support material or
Right.
whatever, audio attached.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I actually, I'd never thought of that. That's a really good one.
Then do you want to talk about submissions of scores?
Yeah,
or,
so
or
I was gonna
call for scores.
Yes, I want to get to. I'm going to ask this question first, and then I want to do calls for scores, because there's a specific question about that, and I know that there's a lot to talk about there.
Sure.
This is more support letters than necessarily support materials, but when it comes to support letters, who carries the most weight? Is it the commissioner or someone who has past experience working with you? Who are the best people to get letters from besides a commissioner?
Performer who is going to be performing the piece.
Okay.
Right. That makes sense. Like somebody who, it doesn't make sense to have a support letter from somebody who knows you unless they're going to be involved in your project. Like it's very different if you're applying to, join an organization, or, if you're applying for a job, then you want a support letter about you and, how reliable you are, that kind of thing. But not for a grant application. I think you really want to make sure that you've got the right person at the organization writing the support letter. So, often you might find that it might be an arts admin staff member who's tasked with giving you a support letter. But as a composer, you can say, actually, you know what, can we make it so that it's someone on the artistic team? Like I have written support letters, right. Makes sense, right? When they're HPO commissions. But it could, like the executive director could make a great support letter, but then the ED might say, well, can you give us some content, right? So as a composer, you can give them some things that you will do in the piece so that they have an idea of what they're writing about. But again, if you have the music director or conductor doing it, then that's even better. It doesn't happen that often that you see support letters from a conductor who will be premiering the work, but occasionally.
Okay. Related to that, it makes me just, while we're here, so that's for grants. So for let's say for programs, for residencies, things like that, where you might be, there is a bit of a job element. Where would the value be of, say, again, a letter from a collaborator or a performer versus the letter of maybe a more senior composer who's been a mentor, or even like a teacher? Do those come in handy in those situations, or is there a sort of hierarchy of what's preferred?
I actually haven't seen any. Apart from HPO, I have been involved in some other orchestras selecting, emerging composers for their programs, and I haven't seen support letters be part of it.
Okay.
It's generally more just music and what you want to get out of it. The support letters, and I think jobs and university positions. I don't know. If it comes up, sure. I think the big thing would just be about reliability, because something that I have faced in the program I run is that sometimes people might say they want to be involved and engaged, but in reality they don't show up very much. So someone
who can speak to your commitment and your I know the generation, which I know is long gone, but that old ECM generation 2 were called for at least one letter, of reference letter, when you used to apply for that. So, but maybe it's a thing of the past. I know that they're a bit of a thing of the past now. Okay, calls for. Let's split this into 2, because I think you've served in roles where you've come across both of these, sort of calls for scores, whether that's for a performance or a reading session. And then related to that is sending, like basically cold calling, sending scores to orchestras, probably more so than chamber ensembles, but because you tend to have a personal relationship. But so let's start. How to improve your, Hamiltonville or Toronto calls for, opens up a call for orchestral scores. How would you make a strong submission to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, calls for scores, of course, need to be, and any organization. So the benefit of calls for scores is that you know exactly the instrumentation, right? They say it's for this instrumentation, and we're looking for pieces maximum this duration generally. So that really helps. But a lot of people just send in scores randomly to orchestras, to organizations, and you kind of have to sort through that or handle it. So, I mean, when I was at TSO, we would spend some days just pouring through scores that had been sent in. A lot of them are international. They're publishers that are just shipping out bundles of scores to different orchestras. And invariably those are just sent back.
Okay.
But it's different when a Canadian composer writes a letter and sends a score and sends a recording, and here it is. Then it's more seriously considered always, because we do have a dedication to our Canadian scene. I think every organization does or should. So things to bear in mind for that is look at the organization before you're sending it. Even in terms of orchestras, we have a huge difference in size in Canada. And I think young composers especially think, oh, orchestra is massive and it can mean anything I want to write. So they're writing, huge Mahler size pieces, which are just not practical. So, I mean, there aren't many orchestras in Canada that can handle absolutely massive orchestras because it's just too expensive, right? Every player there needs to be paid for. So, I mean, the music director at HPO is always telling our composer fellows, write pieces that are Mozart-sized orchestras. That's what's getting done, and they're getting done all over the place. So that's something to think about. Like double winds and like timpani player and no extra percussion. Whereas, so I mean, you've asked about red flags. The red flag is when I see somebody saying, "Yeah, okay, will you play my piece?" And here it is, and it's triple winds and quadruple brass and 5 percussion players and piano and harp and this and that.
Or doubling on English horn.
All of the doublings. Yeah, people don't take into that into consideration necessarily. So that gets expensive too. So that's just out the window. And also to think about, how does the organization program? With orchestras, we tend to have a contemporary piece, hopefully, on the start of the program. Then we've got a concerto. This gets mixed up if it's a contemporary concerto, this formula. And then on the second half, we have a symphony, right? So if you know that, then think, okay, how long can my piece be that I'm submitting? What are the sizes of programs they're doing? And how can my instrumentation reflect this? Also, when submitting it, it's just so helpful if you've got a folder and a link you're submitting so that I can forward that link on and I don't have to be responsible for all of those files and getting those on. Also just a recognition that programming happens kind of gradually. So we might bring it up and it might work, another year. So to keep that in mind.
And it also happens years in advance. You're not, don't be saying, here's the thing, could you play it next year? Like, probably the program's set.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing which is tricky is that some people specifically pitch with a certain player in mind. So for example, they might have, again, about the idea of collaboration and community and multiple premieres, it's great, but what if the composer is writing a piece for their local orchestra and it is for the principal whatever player as a concerto, and then the player says, oh, let's get it out to other orchestras so we can have more performances. Sounds great. But then what's happening is that composer or that player is pitching to another orchestra to program the principal whatever player at another orchestra, whereas actually that orchestra wants to program their principal player instead. So it's a natural conflict of interest, right? I mean, if they're programming, a touring virtuoso soloist, that's another thing. It's a different sort of, it's a different creature. But yeah, putting another orchestra player in as soloist rather than yours is a bit sticky.
Okay.
So things like that. The other thing is just being very, very clear about themes. A lot of music directors program thematically, especially at organizations that aren't putting on, two different concerts a week kind of thing. They've got a concert for Remembrance Day, and they've got a concert for spring, and they've got a concert for whatever, this and this and this. So, some composers have done very well by having thematic pieces, not necessarily programmatic, but just, there's a sort of a general kind of theme there.
Right.
And being very, very clear about instrumentation, doubling a percussion number of players, percussion list, and having all of this available on your website and perusal score, archival audio, all of that sort of thing.
Okay.
But just a note too that touching in on the program application and the sending music into organizations, it can be really beneficial to apply to certain programs if you fit. And we have numerously programmed pieces from composers who weren't quite a fit, interestingly. So they may have been too, I don't want to say advanced, but further along in their career. We just say, you don't need our mentorship experience here, but we like your music,
yeah,
and we're going to program it. Or we also find situations where we have people applying that are not, quite along. They're maybe too involved in their own school. They haven't gotten out into the world, but they're doing some interesting things. We might say, oh, we've got a program for you where we can give you some mentorship and a little bit of money, and we'll give you a reading.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So in an organization like ours, those sorts of things are always fluid.
Yeah.
But you have to find your way into the organization, let yourself be known, and then we might find a fit for you at some point, and maybe it's a few years down the road. Same thing with an application. It might be a few years down the road that people are actually accepted.
I was going to say, I think that's a common, especially with the younger composer, I use that as big scare quotes, but a common thing is, we really like this, apply next year or apply in 2 years. And that does really count for something. I mean, I can think of many examples of successful composers who applied 3 or 4 or 5 times for any number of the big mentorship programs. So emphasizing that importance of applying early, sometimes there's a benefit. A good question, there's a couple good questions coming up here. And this is one I actually want to touch on was, this is sort of, this phrase is, can you talk about level of difficulty for call for scorers? And I would also extend that to a bit of length and also difficulty and rehearsability. How important are those when it comes time to decide? And I guess is the difference there between applying for a reading session versus, if it's actually going to get a performance. So if you could talk to that for a bit.
Yeah. Okay. Reading sessions are typically, they would cap out at maybe half an hour, right? So you want to make sure that they can play through the piece once, work on a few things, pull it together, and then play through the piece again. So if you've got a long piece, that's not going to be that functional. I mean, an ideal would be under 10 minutes for a reading session so that you can make that happen. And a lot of programs as well would have 5, 6, or 8 minute piece, that kind of thing. So that's what we're looking at for this point. Now, with regards to complexity and playability, that is a very good question. And I think it depends on the organization you're applying to. If you're applying to a new music organization that's, say, a chamber group that's conducted, that's all new music players, you can be writing more complex music. First of all, you have to think, is it conducted or is it not conducted? If it's not conducted and it's really complicated rhythmically and to put together, it's my goodness, it's going to be challenging. And some organizations won't take it because they'll say, wow, this is a great piece, but there's no way we can do it. So you sometimes are shooting yourself in the foot if you're writing music which is too difficult. It just is. Then when we get to orchestras, a standard is that you've got 3 rehearsals plus dress. And if you're part of a program, you tend to get a bit more time, rehearsal time. But I mean, your piece does kind of have to come off the page. Now, you can expect that, of course, everyone will have rehearsed before the first rehearsal, but putting it together is the main thing. So you can have really challenging things in individual lines. But if you've got, really tricky things string section, that can be tough to come together, and in the end will just make the strings look bad. There's that. Whereas if you're writing really challenging lines for your super excellent principal wind players, well, that's great, go nuts, right? So find the place for it is the thing.
That's a really good point.
And also balance it out. Like if you're writing an 8-minute piece, which is brutally complicated from beginning to end with a million, tempo and time signature changes, maybe don't for orchestra. Maybe think, okay, I really want this section, but I'm going to do it in this 2-minute spot in the middle. And then the other parts are easier. So balance, think about how much time you have in general. Yeah, I think just a recognition of that.
Yeah. And this is probably a good point to just put in the thing about splitting up string parts. This overly dividing your strings is, I gather, not great for these sorts of situations. If you're looking for 20,
well,
if you're going into Ligeti territory.
Yeah, I mean, you hope, of course, we all hope that we're going to get many performances of our pieces, right? So if you're writing for a very specific string count, then that is automatically going to close some doors with some other orchestras that may do it, right? Because they're like, wow, we don't want to hire those players, so too bad. Whereas if it's just strings or like simple divisi, they can always figure that out. So there's just that. It's just not that practical. It can be a drain on the orchestra librarian. Some orchestras have, full-time orchestra librarian. They will suck it up and do it. They won't be so happy, but they'll do it. Others, the librarian is really part-time, and that puts a huge strain on them. Also, it just might not sound as good as you think. And you can take advantage of, writing for the string section the way it was intended. But I don't know. I mean, it can work if it's not too much of a stretch. Like
right.
Maybe if you divide it into 4, 3, or 4, or even 5 is getting to be a bit of a stretch depending on the orchestra, because even if you have double wind parts, you're still restricting yourself to an orchestra which is playing newer music. Otherwise you can't fit on a classical program.
Right. Another good question that's come up here, and this applies again in both situations, and I think some of this will go back to talking about especially fit with performers and fit with ensembles. Can you address how the aesthetics or musical language of a composer can impact grant applications and score submissions? For example, are composers who lean towards more traditional tonal writing at a disadvantage?
Yeah, I mean, you at the municipal level, no, they may even have an advantage, because you're having people on the jury that are not new music specialists, so they will listen to more tonal music and say, oh, thank you, that's great, that's a great composer, right? But when you're writing for, provincial and federal applications, yeah, if you're writing music which doesn't push any boundaries at all, you're probably going to get a comment of like, this is too safe. I don't feel that they're pushing themselves, that kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. So finding the right balance there. But in a similar way too, for applications, I have for programs, I have had people submitting pieces which are very, very traditional, like they're writing in a different style entirely, the classical style or romantic or even like tango. And then I think, okay, that isn't actually the style of your time, and potentially you're writing in a different style, and that's great, you can do that, but so we want to see you, the person. So if it's a legitimate personal statement and that's the way you write, then great. But yeah, I think at some levels of juries that can be problematic. I'm just being honest about it here. But not to say that tonal music isn't accepted. It is, but maybe you can find in your support material ways where you're being a little bit more experimental. Again, getting that idea of contrast, so your two pieces don't sound exactly the same. Yeah,
or as you say, underlining why you're doing it. Like, why is that your language? It's not just you did a technical exercise to imitate, Mozart's Fifth or whatever. Like you're
and now, I mean, composers are fusing more styles than ever, right? And we live in this time where it's not 1970, so it's total.
You can write a major chord, no one will shoot you.
Yeah, the answer to that 20 years ago would have been different.
I remember when it was very different. Should we avoid doubling at all costs for financial reasons?
Oh, good question. yeah, this has sort of turned into an orchestra question, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So, so there's some pretty standard doublings you can be okay with, like second flute doubling piccolo. That's pretty standard. You can be sure that that would be on most programs, or that the orchestra wouldn't mind too much. Second clarinet doubling bass clarinet. Okay, we can handle that. English horn is also a really common doubler for the second oboe. Keep it in balance. So if you write a piece where everyone doubles, probably the orchestra manager is going to price that out and say, you know what, it's a bit pricey for this little piece. As well, if your piece is a bit longer and there's going to be, it's more a substantial part of the program, then that's legitimate. And here's another thing: if you're going to double, make use of it.
I was about to say,
okay, for two measures, I want the English horn.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just all about balance. Like I said, if you have a couple of doublings, the orchestra will probably be okay with it. That player will be paid more. It's not double, but I mean, it's a little bit more, and it comes up for sure. I mean, same thing with putting piano. Some people think, oh, it's easy to put piano in an orchestra score. Well, a lot of the time the orchestra has to rent that piano.
Yeah.
And if there's harp in there, well, then there's cartage for the harp. So if you're going to use the harp, just use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to do harp cartage actually as a side gig. And I guess piano too, you've got to move the piano on, you've got your union guys. Like the piano's not a default,
Totally.
it's not a default on stage instrument.
Yeah.
And I would emphasize too with percussion there, just like again,
Oh.
having worked for a company that does percussion rentals, be wary of the weird stuff, because then they got to go rent it.
Yeah, rent it. And also the big stuff, again, make it appropriate to the size of your piece. Like, do you really need to have 4 different keyboard percussion instruments in your 6-minute piece? Maybe you don't. So you can be careful about that. And also overwriting the percussion part, because some percussionists look at that and say, that is too much for one player. You might be able to get away with it in a sort of contemporary kind of magical percussion player that can play 5 different instruments at once, but in orchestra they say we're going to need 2 players for that.
Right. Is there I can't remember, is there sort of a default these days, like 2 or 3, like I guess 2 percussionists plus timpani for these sessions?
No, I mean, a lot of classical programs wouldn't even have any percussionists at all. So it's just timpani is like always timpani. Maybe you have 1 percussion, maybe you have 2 if it's big, and if it's really big, then maybe you've got 3.
Right. Okay. A bit related, there's a lot of we're getting more like practical stuff here, which I think is good, because I think people underestimate the practicality side of this.
Yeah. And the decisions are not necessarily artistic. Sometimes they're practical.
Yeah. And so I think it's really, really, especially as everyone's budgets are getting tighter, it's really important to keep this in mind. Is it best to use, I guess this is a call for scores question, but is it best to use all of the available instruments versus a smaller subset of the ensemble? It's an interesting one.
Yeah, it is. It depends on the type of organization. If it's an orchestra, then everyone's going to be sitting on the stage, so why not use them all?
Right.
If it's a chamber, then okay. My personal feeling is I really hate the idea of people writing pieces specifically for a call for scores, because then they might not make it in. Chances are they won't, because a lot of people apply, and then they've got this piece afterwards they don't know what to do with, which is written for a bizarre ensemble that could never get performed again. So I would say write the piece. If you're going to write for a call for scores, choose a piece that you want to write and that you think could have a life afterwards. Maybe you have a lead on some players you could pull together to do it. So try to make it practical for you.
That's why the CLC strongly advises against cold call for scores. Like, submit a project proposal is really great. Submit a call for score, submit a score that's never been performed before, or that that you have to write for a thing. We're very against that.
Yes.
For precisely this reason.
Exactly.
It's unpaid and unfair labor.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, at HPO too, we don't have that situation. We have apply, tell us who you are, and if we choose you, then you write.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
That we won't be getting an angry letter from me.
No. You know what? I did that early on. I did that when I was a student. I wrote for call for scores, and I didn't get it in, of course, and I then regretted it. So I've never done it since.
Yeah.
And I try to tell my students not to do that.
I lucked out on a call for trombone, violin, and piano that could get picked, which was a pretty pretty strange one, but it's
Yeah.
never been played,
Yeah, but still, you could put that together again.
Yep,
Right?
yep.
That's not onerous, but
Yeah.
I mean, what if it's something huge and bizarre?
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
then you just feel bitter and sad, and that's
It's enough of that for composers.
yeah.
This is a little unrelated, but I think I'm going to ask it because this is coming up more and more in I find with composers and with our CLC members especially, because a lot of these programs are geared towards either educational programs or younger composers, emerging composers, but. And you talked so much about like fitting where you are professionally versus where you are versus what is the nature of the program. Do you have kind of suggestions for, let's call them late emerging composers in this kind of context? Like for the HPO thing, and I think I know the answer, but is age more important than like career status sort of thing?
So I mean, we used to have competitions, right? That had the age cut off, and at first it was 30 and then 35, and that's kind of gone up to 40. But now mainly a lot of them don't exist with an age cutoff, right? Because we recognize that people are starting their careers at different points. So absolutely, the career stage doesn't actually tie into age. It's about what they've done.
Okay.
That's quite important for me. But at the same time, though, I mentioned that, that we've had some people who are retired applying. But that's also not a fit because I know that they're not going to, dedicate their lives to the music scene and need to learn that, right? So they're doing it for a different reason. So I basically want to make sure that whoever's coming in, first of all, has a good shot at it, that we're like, this is a pretty intense program. We want to make sure that someone's kind of like, they're not here, like they've already kind of made a few steps. They are not just writing within their university. They're really trying to get out there, and they've been involved, and they've written for some pros, maybe not orchestra. They may be written for their community orchestra, that kind of thing, or youth orchestra or school orchestra or whatever. But then, so I feel like they can go into that professional level, and they can write something which will be good on stage.
Right.
So if they've already had professional commissions, regardless of their age, they're kind of beyond that. I'm happy. Good, and maybe we'll program a piece of theirs. So yeah, it's about stage, not age.
Okay, that's a good point. Thank you, Joseph, for sharing the guidelines for calls for scores and proposals from the CLC in the chat. We'll take the hits to the website. Do you have a couple of points that we should make sure we cover in our letter/personal info in a call for scores application? Things that people often leave out but shouldn't. I'm assuming that's kind of more biographical stuff or more personal information than necessarily like a project information.
Information for calls for scores.
Information, I guess and the person who's asking this, please correct me if I'm misreading this, but this sounds like it's more about cover letters and personal information when applying for a call for scores.
Okay, so I've seen so a lot of calls for scores, because they've actually initiated a call for scores, they have certain information they want from you. So that's in a way easier, right?
Yeah.
It's the cold calling. What do you need to put in there?
Okay, yeah.
So I would say it would be a good idea to put in a bio. Oh, and about CVs too. People often so many times I've seen this.
I think I know where this is going.
Yes, like your job at Starbucks, or your like all of those other things. We don't want to see them in your CV for a grant application.
Have an artist CV and a job CV.
Exactly. I mentioned it about the performer CV. Make sure that's different, or the performer bio. But yeah, it's surprising how many times. And we also see, their volunteer work going back to high school or something, like not relevant. Make it about your work only.
Although I would say if there's community music stuff, if you volunteer to be a community music something, that might be worth putting in there. Yeah.
But if you're now 35,
oh yeah,
and you're writing like, I volunteered at this when I was 17.
That's fair.
Maybe not.
Yeah, that's fair.
You see it because people don't update their CVs, right? Or they update the front page and then they include their, So that, but yeah, in just a general sort of like submission, if you don't know the person you're submitting to, often, an orchestra might have a kind of a front person, like an affiliate composer or something. And so you kind of know them. They might know you, then fair enough. You don't have to give your bio. But otherwise, I had somebody recently pitch a piece to me, and he said, "Oh, I heard from your this person within your orchestra that you have a new music series for this sort of size ensemble. I have a piece like this, and it has never been premiered, even though it was commissioned. There was a problem with the premiere. And here's the ensemble. Here's the size of it. Here's the percussion listing. Oh, and by the way, I grew up in your city." Right? Like, oh, this is starting to look pretty strong here, right? So any sort of information that might tie you to a program that they're offering. So that was like, I have a piece you want. It hasn't been premiered, and I'm from there. And you should have programmed me years ago, by the way. Like they didn't have to say that,
course,
but that's
but
kind of like the unwritten thing. And I found out about it and know someone in your ensemble. So a few different ways, if you want to say, like, basically, it's respectful to say, I've looked into what you do, and I think I have something that fits.
Right.
Rather than, oh, I'm doing something huge, which is totally irrelevant to you. Would you like it?
Yeah. Showing that you've put a bit of work in and that you care a little bit about and then it's not just a generic cold call that keeps coming up.
And then also, a brief bio probably of kind of who you are, about your stage in your career. That kind of thing can be helpful if they don't know you.
Right. Okay, that's very helpful. I've been doing a lot of online questions. We're now down a person, but do either of you guys or any of you guys have a question that you've wanted to ask or would like to ask? Andrew, you look like you have one.
Yeah, because I've been holding it in my head all session and
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
I do have a question actually. In terms of orchestra size, when you're calling for applicants so that the selected applicants will write a new piece for the orchestra, do you take the size of the orchestra portrayed in the application as a potential that the sound can reach, or as a red flag, like this person writes for bigger ensembles, maybe we should worry about that?
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I think if you're submitting a piece in your application where you have an archival recording of a piece that was performed for that big orchestra, great, good for you, right? Fantastic. If you write in your application that you want to write a piece which is incredibly massive, and your vision is around this piece which is incredibly massive, that would be a bit of a red flag. As another example, I had someone write in that they would like to write a violin concerto for themselves playing. And I was thinking, uh-oh. But then, following up with that was, but I would be happy to write anything. This is just an option. So I think to say, if you have this vision, say, this is what I have in mind, but I'm also happy to be flexible with what you have in mind. Because a lot of the time, we would be choosing our composer fellows, not necessarily fitting them to a program yet, right? We would choose you and then say afterwards, oh, where do they fit? Oh, this person wants to write a piece about that. That would be great. We had a composer just write for a piece for Remembrance Day. Ah, perfect, right? Okay, this one, yeah, I can really see her fitting here. Or if you have a thematic idea, that can be helpful too, because we can place you into programming. So I guess just don't close the door by your grand vision and say, but I want to work with you and would be happy to take some guidance on this. Then we'd say, oh, what a dream. Thank you.
So when I was about 10 years ago, when I was younger, I had a trustworthy musical professional tell me to leave off my birthday, leave off my school, and leave off my teachers from my boss. And that was to make, because if you look at a lot of senior composers, that's what they do. They try and, I'm not sure if it's because they want to look that they were self-taught, or they want to look like they're not part of the academic system. Now, Maria, Eduarda, and I are in call for scores. And we have a lot of young composers. And I'm noticing that some composers leave off their school, leave off their teachers, leave off their age. And suddenly, the these applications, I'm hesitant to choose them. I feel like they're fake. And I have to form a relationship with people, but I don't know exactly who they are. So I'm wondering if you have an idea of that. if there's a certain point in your career where you switch, what would you recommend for emerging with both?
Yeah, that's quite a deep question. Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I think emerging composers often have their schools and their teachers, they don't have a full, necessarily a full bio. And I think you tend to kind of drop your teachers off of your bio, because also you know, you might turn, go in different directions, and sometimes, you have word count restrictions on your bios, and you might want to look like you're a professional composer and, aren't listing your teachers. Depends on the situation. Personally, I don't have my teachers in my bio, but I have them in my CV, like exactly where I went to school and who I studied with. So for our call, we request a CV as well, and a bio. I actually like having the bio and the CV, so that you can get that information. Birth date, that's an interesting one. I guess that could lead towards certain biases, knowing that. I think maybe young composers don't want to be seen as young composers, and so they're leaving that off. I don't know how I feel about that one. I tend to figure out the stage, again, stage, not age. You can kind of read between the lines and figure out approximately their situation. But you're right, we do want trust. That this program the programs are about trust. The people running it want to get as much from you as you want to get from us. We just want people to engage and to want it, and so to feel that you're hiding things is not the best. Yeah.
That was a really good question. I would extend it a little bit. Does that apply in a grant situation?
Yeah, you want to say you're young,
Right,
because
right.
then you're in a priority group. So
Yeah.
champion that, right? And also, well, I mean, priority groups have changed, right? It used to be that priority groups were, maybe 30% and now priority groups are much, much higher. And in a granting situation, if you say that you're young and that you're, whatever, I mean, you could even sort of hint that you could say in my 20s or something, you don't necessarily need to write your exact birthday. But you're going to have the jurors give you a little more leeway, I think, and understand why you don't have that perfect second audio example, right? Whereas with the older composers, we expect everything to be just perfect. So that's a time where you want to say, yes, I am trained, I am fully professional, I have done everything I need to do, but by the way, I'm young. Yeah. Go for it.
Okay, so any more questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think you kind of touched on this when we were talking about support material. But so I feel like I'm in a position where all of my best work doesn't really feel like it fits in the application. So sort of, I guess, what are some ways to deal with, I guess, if you have, like, for example, works that don't have scores, or works that are very long, people aren't really going to be able to listen to them in jury settings, is it better to just submit older stuff? Like, when you said old stuff, you also said like 10+ years, which is, I've been worried about submitting stuff that's like 40 years. That feels, but it also, like, personally, to me, it often feels like, oh, that's like a whole other composer writing that music. It's not actually relevant. So I wonder if you can, I don't know, share something about that, like how to deal with, like, what are some strategies to deal with support material that doesn't necessarily fit the thing you're applying for, or maybe it is better to just submit older stuff in those kinds of situations.
Yeah, I think that would actually make for a pretty good project description, and again, to highlight the pieces that you're submitting. Right, to say that you're planning on writing something a little more like this, which is reflected in this example, which is, meant for longer listening, that kind of thing. So if you just draw attention to it, You know, that it evolves gradually over the 5 minutes. That won't be shown in the listening example because it can't be, but that evolution is important to my style, and you know, just write it up basically. But if you submitted 2 pieces which were very slow moving and hardly had anything in them, you're not likely to get it. So yeah, I would say submit the 4-year-old piece with some contrast in it. And I mean, 4 years at your stage feels like a long time, but and you know what, at one point I had an applicant for the fellowship program apply with an 8-year-old piece. Now for me, that was a bit of a red flag because that was a completely different time in their lives, in a different country. So much had happened in this person's life since then. So that was a bit much, but we took him anyway. So it worked because it was good music. So if it's good music, don't worry about it too much, but really highlight the contrast and explain it. That's the best I can give you.
That was a good question. Okay, so I think we're coming up to I'm not getting a lot more questions in the chat. If you are in the chat and you have a burning question to throw in there, pop it in now. But I'm going to end with the question that I always end these with, which is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Is there something that I missed that that you feel is really important to cover in the context of this discussion? Or any final parting words of advice?
Yeah, I guess, you know, just to say that not getting a grant can feel terrible, right? And you feel like, am I doing the right thing? Should I switch careers here? Is this going anywhere? And we've all been there, right? The thing is, though, you can apply again and you can get a different jury. And like I said, you could have got an 87 and the cutoff is here and there's no recognition of that. At the same time, maybe you are actually making some mistakes and you should call the grant officer and ask for some feedback, because that can be helpful too. You can also ask a friend to read through your project description and see if something's unclear. You know, there can be language problems. There can be all sorts of problems that, you know, that your art is in the right place, but your application isn't quite in the right place. So you can ask for help. There's no law against doing that. And apply again. I mean, I can't state this enough. But like for our composer fellowship program, so many of our composers applied in previous years and we loved them. And we thought, oh, wow, great. We want to keep an eye on them and, you know, we'll have them the next year or the following year. Yeah. And also, like I said, we look through, luckily we can pivot and make a program for somebody who we think is great, but that doesn't quite fit into that box. So that doesn't work with a grant application, but it might with an organization. So it's worth pitching why you want to work with them. And, you know, if you in your application show somehow, like this came up earlier, that you know a little bit about what they're doing and why you want it. I mean, this is another thing. People don't read the application. They don't see everything that is being offered and say what they want about it. They'll make something up about it, which doesn't exist. So just being very clear about, you know, what their organization is about, you know, what kinds of things they're programming, and this is how you can fit into it would be a good idea. And then lastly too, we are putting out our call for the Composer Fellowship again. This is a partnership with the Canadian Music Centre, so that's available at hpo.org and through the CMC. So please apply, and there will be me on the jury and the music director and a player who's well versed in new music and an executive director, our executive director. So that's the way it works on that jury.
Awesome. And I would also say as well, this is a bit of a preview, but the CLC will be putting out a resource soon. That is basically going to be a series of previously successful grants that we've redacted everyone's personal information. We've gone through everything, redacted everything that can possibly identify the person of the project, but it will be a source of Canada Council, provincial grants, municipal grants that you can go and read through and use as a kind of guideline if you're stuck or if you're looking for a place to start with the grant application. So keep your eye out for that. within the next, like, probably couple months, we'll have that up on our website. So I'll make sure to let everyone know. We have one final question. This is a very practical question. And then we're gonna probably cut it off.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to justify subsistence costs. I'm applying for subsistence because I want this to be my job for the next 6 months. Is that sufficient justification? This is getting into budget stuff, which I know we kind of avoided, but feels like it's a topic for another day. But
Yeah.
do you have anything on that one?
Yeah, that's tricky. You know, I mean, I think if you're applying to municipal, I mean, to get enough to live on for 6 months, that's actually a pretty big ask.
Yeah, especially in Toronto.
Yeah, exactly. And they're probably a bit more likely to, a lot of the artists from other fields are doing exactly that. You know, the ones from our sort of new music world are saying, CLC rates, but people from, you know, the pop world and everything else, they're saying, this is how much my rent is. This is how much this is. So it depends what you're applying for. Municipal, absolutely. Because municipal, they won't know what CLC is.
Right.
Generally.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I don't know. I don't know. That's a tough one. I mean, you could, I think you might want to draw a comparison to CLC rates. Like if I were applying for CLC rates, it would be this, but I'm applying for subsistence costs instead because this is my life situation.
Okay.
I think if you can explain something, then the people are more likely to go with you.
My first thought looking at that question is we should do one of these, but on project budgeting would be it, because I think that's a whole other topic that scares the crap out of a lot of composers. But
yeah.
I think I'm gonna call it there. That was at least for me, that was really informative. I thought that was full of a lot of amazing information, completely not what we get from even some of the grant application stuff, program like webinars we've done in the past from the CLC. And I'd like to really thank you for your time and for your energy and for your thoughtful responses.
My pleasure.
I'd like to thank everyone who's here, and I'd like to thank everyone who showed up online. And yeah, keep your eyes out. The next Rivers workshop will be in early 2024. And so with that, thank you.
Thank you.